Okay, we'll go on ahead and get started. To start off the panel, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves, briefly maybe talk about your research, and I don't know, since we just finished the film, a favorite moment.
I'm like ADHD, like psychotically like flipping through everything right now, and I can't really pick anything out, but yeah, I don't have a favorite moment.
Okay.
But
that's okay.
Yeah, sorry. But how it relates to my research, I could totally do that one. So hi, historian. Is that that's what you want me to do? Okay, yeah, I'm gonna do that. So I'm a historian, but I study the really boring stuff of this. So like the economic background and like clothes and landscape and stuff, that's the me guy. So the other stuff is that guy. But essentially, I look at 17th and 18th century economics and commercial exchange across the Atlantic between the British, the Caribbean, and the colonies. Well, the Caribbean is the colonies. But and I kind of make big ties between the role of economics and big ideas, between things like liberty, which are big themes that tie into the film. So.
Great, thank you.
So hi, I'm Brendon. I do the funner stuff, I guess, as they would say. Yeah. So my current project is actually looking at Irish radicalism later on in the 18th century, but I teach a couple classes on pirates, and I focus on the social aspect of it, which is the fun part, which is pirates actually on the ships, how the ships organize themselves, what pirate culture was. And yeah, it turns out when I originally started doing this stuff, I didn't think people would be into it. Turns out people are actually really interested in pirates. So yeah, they're gonna So.
Great.
I'll leave the economics to Shannan
Thanks.
here.
Mercantilism, I'm your guy.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think I have an intro question for both of you to tie into your research. Shannan, could you speak to maybe some of the accuracy or the depictions of what we see of mercantilism and trade as it takes place in the British colonies of the Caribbean? And then for Brendon, maybe talking about what is kind of thinking pirate culture and how we might think of it as it's represented in the film to different from what you've noticed in your research.
Mercantilism. I feel like I need a PowerPoint slide just to really get really professor on you guys right now. So. Okay, so the things that are accurate, all right, that I really, really liked about the movie, because I haven't seen it in like 10 years, so I was actually pretty excited. So the things that they totally get right is the tension between the Admiralty and the pirates based on when this is. However, the thing that they get wrong is that pirates are the enemy always, because that's totally not accurate. And the British government very deeply cared about its pockets. It's literally the motivating factor for every decision that the empire makes is its pocketbook. And they employ pirates to help their pocket, and once they no longer help that pocket, they turn against the pirates. And the pirates actually become an enemy of the state then. And so they actually employed them as part of a tactic in mercantilism, actually, as buccaneers and as privateers. So individual pirates that are like solo, kind of like Jack is, because he doesn't have a crew. He would be kind of like a buccaneer, I guess, kind of a guy. But if he was employed by the crown, he would be a privateer. If you're not employed by the crown, you are a
Pirate.
Thank you, Brendon. Thank you. All right. So that's kind of like the big thing that actually really frustrates me is that that tension is not really figured out. Also, the rum runners, it's not a thing. It's really not a thing. I was like, what is happening? I don't even think that's a thing until the 1930s, quite honestly. But it worked out for Jack, so I'm very happy about that. And then the other thing that I did want to say is that in terms of mercantilism, they don't do a very good job of kind of fleshing out the different kinds, how multicultural the space actually was. Because these are spaces that are attended by all different, not only European nations, right, like France and Spain, and then England, who are controlling the Caribbean, But they're also like the pirate ships and stuff like that, and the people working on these islands are actually not a majority white that you see inside of these images or inside of the movie. I don't really know like exact statistics, but I heard it was like something like 70% of crews were black, or at the very least non-white. And so like that's a really important part of the economics, because why are those people there in the first place? And the answer is slavery, right? So we're actually taking these people and putting them in the Caribbean to work on plantations. And many of those people that are working on pirate ships actually escaped from that. They marooned themselves, essentially, or self-emancipated. And they saw piracy as a way to live free. So for them, piracy was a way of living free. Whereas for the British and like the empires that will be, they saw those people then as a direct challenge to that authority, as well as their pocketbook. But let's remember the pocket is always first, all right? The pocket always wins, all right? And so when the pirates actually started interrupting trade, and essentially the Spanish and the British right back home saying like, look, I cannot get a single ship in or out of these bays. And because of that they're not able to export the things that they brought people to those spaces to labor enslaved, right, on those islands, that they're not able to like make money off of that effort, that's when they turn against the pirates. So I guess that's kind of the connection to what I do.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer and really touched on some questions that I had about thinking, as I would imagine, that most of these pirate ship crews were multiracial crews. We see some glimpses of it in the film, but not really touching upon the reality of the populations in the Caribbean.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on that multiracial kind of crew there. So one thing you got to remember is that we put the golden age of piracy, probably 1640s to 1725, around there. What we're looking at during Pirates of the Caribbean is the late golden age. So this would be the era where you actually do have real pirates. You have pirates that are operating outside of state control, right? So you have buccaneers and pirateers. By the late golden age and after the War of Spanish Succession, what you have is a lot of privateers feeling like they've been abandoned by their government, right? Like a lot of sailors feeling like, oh, I don't have the marquee of government anymore, because all of a sudden some government that is thousands of miles away said we're at peace, so I can't have my war anymore. Like I can't have that booty anymore. And so they decide to go, they decide to go on what they would call the account, right? I'm going on account. And that would mean to go pirate. And these ships were multicultural in the sense that these were ships that did navigate the globe. They would attract individuals that felt betrayed by their captains, that felt underpaid by their captains. These would tend to be younger males who did not feel fairly treated by the world at that time. But I do want to say this. The lifespan of a pirate was 1 to 3 years. So we have to put that in context, right? So I think when we think of pirates, we think of these long-term kind of things. It was not that. But they were highly connected to each other. Blackbeard, Calico Jack, I don't know if you guys have heard of these names, Charles Vane, all these captains that we know about today all worked with each other at some point. And they were probably all part of a privateer or, ironically, the British Navy. And they got together at the end of the Spanish, and they started a kind of space called Nassau. I don't know how many people know about Nassau, the Pirate Republic. It is a very interesting space to go with. But this idea of them, though, being these freebooting people who believed in freedom for everybody is, we should kind of put a break on that. So Blackbeard, for example, his quartermaster was Black Caesar. Black Caesar we don't know much about his background. He is said to have been of African royalty. But he was known to have captured slave ships and then sold those slaves back into slavery. But he's also known to capture slave ships and free all the slaves. So it's pirates are complicated. Let's put it that way. So yeah.
Okay, well, great. Before we open it up to audience questions, I think the last question I'd like to ask about, since you both have touched upon it, is this concept of freedom. And kind of either for thinking about the characters' motivations in the films and even touching upon some of the things about the research, the complicated ways of legacies of these pirates and how we think about freedom. Perhaps how does freedom function and what is kind of its role?
Kind of, because my answer is lame. Okay, my answer is so lame, so you're welcome. Okay, so like the idea of freedom, as an economic historian, I immediately go to the money question. So, and like so like as they're talking about the booty and splitting things up equally, those were like ideas that did exist and they were practiced, right? Like by pirates, like that you'd split things up relatively equitably. But the thing that I think like a tension that exists in like the realm of freedom in that is that the other options don't exist, which is what Brendon's saying. That's what he was talking about in terms of like that social and like that they're creating that kind of social cohort for themselves because it does not exist for them elsewhere. Because the way in which that world existed was both simultaneously insanely chaotic and insanely regimented at the same time. So your daily living would be like so monotonous and mundane, like that you would be like sadness. But like the things that you like are forced to do are very like regimented. You have very prescribed roles in society. And so like the idea of freedom is actually like very limited to a very select few people, even in this context. And they're only free in that context, not like in the world. That's why they go there. So that space is actually like kind of like a misfit island of misfit toys is, I guess, the way that I want to think about it. Because I also think about it in terms of like maroon villages in the Low Country in places like the Carolinas and such, where people create isolated little pockets of like identity and community themselves. So I guess that's what the movie kind of inspired me in terms of freedom.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so to pick off, I mean, the American colonies would never have the economy they had without piracy, period. Piracy was intimate and highly advantageous towards the American colony all the way up to the American Revolution. So even once we leave the age of the golden age of piracy, we still see the American colonies needing it because at the end of the day, the West Indies, or what we call the Caribbean today, that's the money box, right? Whereas the North American colonies are what gave supplies gave food substance. None of the colonies in the West Indies or the Caribbean were at all self-sustainable because they focused solely on slavery. And they were to the point where even slaves themselves were not reproducible, right? Like slaves could not reproduce fast enough as they were killed. I'm not sure on the lifespan.
4-year life expectancy in the Caribbean.
Yeah, 4-year life expectancy. So that's why that transatlantic slave trade was so important. But with that said, kind of what was the idea of liberty and freedom? Pirates often say in the source space that they're at war with the world, right? And so they accepted this idea that they were not going to live very long. But these were not, like, I want to go with where some historians go with this romantic kind of notion of them. These were hard people. Right, these were people that lived on the edge of what we would consider, and I'll put this in quotes, civilization, right? Like Nassau, the Pirate Republic in Nassau, before that was Tortuga, kind of like they referred to that in the movie. These were spaces that were incredibly metropolitan in that they had incredible diversity, but these were hard people that were there, right? These were not people that we would... You know, I often think of the Hells Angels kind of coming through Columbia, maybe, right? Like, these were not necessarily what you would want in your shop. These were hard people, and they weren't hard because, like, they chose that way. And their voices, right, through the primary sources, they're that way because they felt the state power. The states, the empire, whatever it was, had abandoned them. Had said, we have used you up for your skills, we're not at war anymore, and therefore we don't have a job for you. And in many times, once a war ended, they would be paid off in the Caribbean, and the British Navy would say, yeah, okay, you're good. you don't get a ride home. What are you talking about, right? Like, you're
Bye.
good.
See you
Bye,
later.
right? Like, and what I mean by paid off ship, once you get into port, they would pay you off as a sailor, and then they would just hold, yeah, you're good. So all of a sudden you had this population of specifically Europeans, right, that would then bring in, through their piracy, other cultures, right? Other, even more specifically, formerly enslaved or enslaved peoples, right? But again, like, the way they approached this was they were living day by day, and they accepted that fate for themselves. And there's very few documentation of actual, like, letters or diaries. But what we've gotten through court-martial papers, what we've gotten through governmental papers, and then one specific source, Charles Johnson, wrote a book, The History of Pirates, in 1725.
It's literally called that, The History of Pirates.
Yeah, and I always say it's William Defoe, but it's not. It's Daniel Defoe, but I always mess up on that one, so I'd say William Defoe to get it out to make sure I don't mess up on it. But Daniel Defoe, you all, Treasure Island. We thought he was the author of this book for a while. He is not. Well, I don't think he is. Other scholars may think he still is. But we don't know quite who wrote this, but what's very obvious is that he did interview a man named Wood Rogers. Wood Rogers was a pirate hunter, was one of the governors of the Bahamas, helped take down Nassau, but we don't know a lot. And the voice of them doesn't come through a lot. But what we do know is they did feel this sense that they were at war with the world. The world did not accept them. The world rejected them at some level. And the other liberty thing that democracy. We think America was the first place to have democracy. I would actually argue these ships were democratically held. If you were a captain, you were voted on as captain. And the only time you had, the one thing Pirates of the Caribbean really gets wrong, tyranny, like Captain Barbossa, was not a real thing. If a captain acted like that, they would be voted out. Benjamin Hornigoon is a really good example. He had a fleet of 4 ships. He refused to attack British ships, so his crewmen voted him out. Blackbeard took control of it. Blackbeard has his armada. I think we all kind of know the story of Blackbeard, but like, there was this sense of agency that you did not normally get as a sailor in the pirate world. That is really important. How that democracy actually looked on a ship, we can have a pleasant debate on that. But it was. Unfortunately, I can't. I would love to find the document that says Thomas Jefferson looked towards pirates for democracy. I have yet to find that document, but if you find it, let me know, and I will help you bring to fame. So.
Great. Well, we'll open it up now to audience questions. My colleague Chloe has a microphone. Please do speak in the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Hello? Oh, okay. I have a quick question about like queer folks and women as pirates, because there were like very limited depiction, but there was depictions of like a femme woman presenting person as like a captain of her own ship. And I also know of like famous pirate queens that were in like Asia and Southeast Asia during this like similar time, or maybe a little later. So my question is like, what knowledge, experience do you have about like queer, like non kind of like traditional folks as pirates, especially as you talk about like these are people who have been rejected by their like traditional government or society, and talk about like culture on ships. So I'm just interested in like what your perspective is on that.
I can. Well, I'll let you talk about women.
Fine. Thank you, Brendon. I'll talk about women. All right? I'm a woman. I can talk about women. So, Brendon. So there are like 2 very infamous Caribbean pirate females. And they actually were on the same ship. But in general, at the later end of the golden age of piracy, theoretically, women were not allowed on board. And if you brought a woman on board, like you and them could be killed, I think. I don't remember what the rule. Yeah? Okay. Brendon's my rule guy, so we'll go with him. And so, like, they did exist, but it was very tenuous. And I do know that when they got caught, they actually used their gender and pleated their bellies. And actually, they both were pregnant. But one of them died in prison. We don't know what happened to the other one. Anne, I don't remember what her last name was, but it's a really crazy story. You should totally look into it for real. As for the
Mary Steed and Anne Bonnet, those are two women.
Thank you. What Reed? I thought was the other one's last name.
Reed, yeah, Mary Reed.
Reed. Okay. But like I do think that the idea of like a fluid space in terms of like gender in the 17th century and the 18th century existed in a way that does not that we are collectively not okay with, and that like there would have been people who like flowed between those spaces. We know that women dressed as men to fight in the Revolutionary War, for example. The other side of that, I don't know, right? I mean, like in terms of like queer identity and identifying, but like you're on a ship for a really long time. I mean, people get lonely, so things happen no matter what. Kinsey scale.
So let's just put this out there. Within the British Navy, if you caught in a homosexual act, that was death penalty.
But pirates, Brendon.
I know. Well, let's let's just put that out there. But with that said, right, there's a huge debate within the historical community about what did sexuality actually mean on a ship, how loosely or how hard did they enforce those rules. And I'm kind of in this camp where, especially towards the end of the 18th century, you could be on a ship 4 to 5 years without ever touching land. That sailors tended to be okay with homosexuality. But it was only when it was overt and caught by an officer that it became an issue for a court-martial. And the only reason any of us have these theories is because there's so few cases of it actually being court-martialed, right? Like, I just recently went through the court-martials for the late 1790s, and there's only a handful of cases. But I think we know human character enough to know that there's a lot more happening on that ship, and that sailors are probably a little bit looser-gooser with that stuff than we are today. And I think we tend maybe to project judgments we have today back. And so, like, the easy answer is we just don't know. The better answer is that there's a lot of nuance there. And when we look at, like, Anne Bonny or Mary Steed and Anne Bonny, is that Anne Bonny had to dress as a man for most of her life, right? She was the daughter of an Irish merchant who, when discovered that she was... No. When she was the daughter of this, when she was discovered that the son who was supposed to be a daughter was a daughter, does that make sense? Was discovered. They moved to America where her father ended up having a good career, but after the mistress of the father, which is Anne Bonny's mom, died, Anne Bonny became the mistress of her father. Without going farther, I think you all can kind of read into that she was raped for a few years. After that by her father, and then she was married off in New York for connections, and then once she got down to the Caribbean through this merchant, she was then sold off to Jack Rackham, Calico Jack, who tried not to do this. It's again, this is where the sources get really confusing, but the point is that any woman that, whether they were gay or not, whether they were transsexual or not, is irrelevant in that the life that they led leading into it to get them to that point was incredibly, like, what we know, the few that we know about was heartbreaking. Just like what we know about Anne Bonny is just like, I can't imagine living her life. But she did. She ended up getting caught with Jack Rackham, was hanged. And Bonny and Mary Steed was on the ship.
But the women were the only one who fought, actually, when they were captured.
Right.
The men all went in the held, I don't even know what the word is, and hid because they were drunk, just to let you all know. Only the women fought.
Yeah, the reason they got the pirate ship so easily was because everyone on the pirate ship was so hammered that they were unable to fight. But Anne Bonny and Mary Steed, as the tale goes, again, like, so much of this is draped in, like, historians are we're trying our best to get through this fog, but man, it is very difficult. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to the next person with the question. We'll go to Eric. And as a two, I forgot to mention, as always, that since we have the connector, Crystal here has T-shirts at the end for those who have asked a question.
So my question is, are there details in the movie that are specific of the Caribbean other than the rum? Because in a sense, I imagine that, well, piracy was not exclusive to the Caribbean. This could also have taken place, I don't know, on the coasts of North South Carolina or Southeast Asia or the Middle East. So was there any detail, were there any details specific on the Caribbean, or can we put this movie anywhere in the tropics?
So, like, I actually looked up the geography of these spaces because I was like, I don't think this looks like that island. Like, for example, like where their base is, Port Royal?
Yeah, Port Royal.
NASA. Yeah.
No,
it's in the film as Port Royal.
Thank you. Yes. So like that, they like picture that as like this mountainous kind of craggy terrain. It's like an empty, flat island. Like, no, not happening. So like, and actually at this time, the colonizers had done so much ecological devastation to these areas that these islands didn't even have any trees on them. So when colonizers actually first arrive in the Caribbean, they are like announced like, holy cow, I don't even know if we're gonna be able to get into these islands because they're so thick with things like trees and like just biota, which I love the flowers. And so, but like within 2 generations, they have almost entirely deforested the entirety of the Caribbean. And so the landscape that was there actually had been totally destroyed at this period of time. And then they were using unsustainable agricultural practices on top of that. And so leaching the soil and things like that. In terms of what the Caribbean looked like, I don't know. I mean, they don't really show us enough. I think that it's just a stand-in, like to make it easy so that we can just go from like one island to another island, and it makes sense. But I don't know other than that.
What the Europeans would call the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean, and then the Chinese actually had probably the most fascinating pirates of them all. There was one woman that was, I can't name her, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she had a fleet of about 150 ships, and she controlled an area off the coast of China that would arguably be a nation through her ability to have brought together a confederation. So as far as like the Caribbean goes, the Caribbean I think represents more of a lawlessness, where the ones that were in the Mediterranean had letters of marque from different North African nations, and then China actually, the ones that were coming off the coast of China. I've heard some about in Japan, but I don't know enough about them to really specify a lot, but I know the ones that were coming off the coast of China. Actually, if we were to talk about ferocity and we're talking about enlargement and actual imperial power, the ones in China, I would say, probably have in this era that we're talking about more power. And Madagascar was there because the East India Company, that was their route. So we had a lot of European pirates in that area. Does that answer your question?
We'll take 2 more questions.
So a couple times in the movie, they like recognize the pirates, like whether it's by the tattoo or Elizabeth being like, oh, I read all these stories about you. There's some level of like fame associated with it. Was that true at the time? Was like the press sharing stories?
Absolutely true. I did not mean to cut you off. I didn't realize how loud I was going to be. I'm sorry. Absolutely true. So these pirates actually, they would create the mythos themselves and then like feed it to people. Like for example, it's like Blackbeard, like put matches in his hat or something like that as he went out. Oh, that's what it was. Okay. Like, and he like roamed around with like 3 pistols at his hip and like a sword. And like he amplified his own myth so that when he showed up, people would just say, hey, I give up. So, and like they were very successful at doing that, and it was a successful tactic. So absolutely, and people in England would absolutely, and like other places, would have known about these pirates. Like they would have been printed in like smaller kinds of like stories or like shared with people, and like people would know who these people were.
Yeah, so if you guys know a historian named Marcus Rediker, he has a great book called Villains Against All Nations that talks about this idea of how piracy uses terrorism versus how the state uses terrorism, and how for a pirate it's all based on reputation. right? So they want to use terror before they take on your boat because they can't afford to lose their boat, they can't afford to lose the men, right? Where the British Navy, they'll use terror as a first resort because they can afford to lose men and whatnot. So he has a great book that kind of deals with this dichotomy between terrorism. And what I find curious about the book is that, you know, the state as a terrorist is not the way we usually think of the state. And it's a great book, but it goes right what Shannan said, right? So Villain of All Nations, Marcus Whitaker, if you're interested in that.
And then we'll take one last question.
It's like hot potato.
So obviously for the purposes of the script, they talk a lot about the pirate code. How, like, was there ever a formalized set of social norms other than, like, you talked a bit about the democracy, but was there anything quite so formalized as that?
Yeah, no, that's actually a phenomenal question because there was no actual like general pirate code, right? So the pirate codes are based off articles. Articles on a ship rule the ship, right? So for the British, it was articles of war, and these articles were read in front of the whole crew at least once a week, and they were, you know, they changed throughout the era, but they basically said, if you do this, I'll kill you. If you do this, you'll get lashes. If you do this, right? If you miss service on Sunday, you get lashes for 25 lashes, whatever it is, right? So I think Morgan was one of the first ones, but Bartholomew was another one. And we only actually have a handful of pirate codes, but the pirate code has since, through fiction, become a generalized idea across the board for all pirates. But the pirate code is actually just articles on a ship that would rule the ship. And this is actually exactly where we go to for this idea of democracy, right? Because we can see it in the codes that we have, where every man gets, every person on the ship gets equal share of the prize. Captain gets 2, quartermaster gets 2. You know, every person's vote, right, is equal except under attack, right? Which means the captain then becomes the tyranny. But then there's usually also a council on the ship, right, that will rule whether they can go after a certain person or not. And the idea of this, I think, really comes from you're trying to really get the most rurally people you can think of, right? These are people that have decided that like society is not for them, and you have to figure out how to rule them. And I think democracy is really the only way to do it. And so that the pirate code is more articles to rule specific ships, and they can vary from ship to ship.
In that regard, it kind of goes with the movie, where like the code is flexible.
Yeah. Except when it's not.
Yeah.
And marooning was a big deal. Like there's a famous story of Edward England, who he was out of Madagascar, but he got marooned because he refused to attack a East Indiaman, right? Which East Indiaman is like a man of war. But by the East India Company, and he got marooned, and that was a real thing. So like if you were to be executed on a pirate ship, it would have to be voted on by the crew. You weren't just like, whereas in the British Navy, you could be executed either by the captain's wish or through a court-martial. The crew had to decide that. And I think this is really where historians kind of struggle between the romance and the reality, right? Like, there is something I want to be true. And it could be true, but like, is it?
And a lot of that is because most of the narratives that were written about pirates were not written to the 19th and 20th century. And so that romantic ideal was dominant in that period. And so it kind of seeped backwards, which happens a lot.
Yeah, most of these men were not literate and did not write a lot, so.
I was wondering that, but you said they read it to the whole crew, so I was like, they're not going to write this down if it's people that are living on the edge of society. They're not going to have that skill.
No, so you had a captain and you had a quartermaster, and the quartermaster would do that. But most of these men did not know how to read or write.
For those who may have not heard the comment of the audience, talking about how these pirates were, since they were illiterate and weren't able to read and write and lived at the edges of society. Well, let's give a round of applause to our panelists for a great conversation. And I am sure they would be welcome to questions. You have their names, so look up to email. And even outside in the Uprise area, if you would like to ask them a question. I know we're able to get to everybody's questions tonight, but thank you all for coming. And Crystal has t-shirts for those who ask questions.